Thanks everyone for being here tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we are meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Okay, so some other things. Toilets to your left if you haven't already figured it out through that door. Mobiles off if you haven't already switched them off. Thank you very much. And also the Twitter hashtag for this evening, as you can see here, #StartupVic. So feel free to tweet about your excellent experiences throughout the evening. Good evening and welcome to this evening's Fireside chat, without the fireside, that is, between John Collison and Paul Bassat to help celebrate the launch of Stripe in Australia. I'm Michelle Burke from Startup Victoria, and to kick off, we'd like to thank our key sponsors, the Victorian Government and professional services firm PricewaterhouseCoopers, online freelancer, contractor marketplaces, Elance and Odesk. Our first event sponsor for this evening also is Chilli. They're a digital agency meets incubator meets accelerator meets VC. And these guys help build tech startups. And all you need to do is pitch them your awesome idea. The second event sponsor is LIFX, which is a Wi-Fi enabled multicolour energy efficient smart LED light bulb. What a mouthful, but really cool. And you can control it with your smartphone. So we have 10 free LIFX bulbs to give away this evening. So if everyone would like to have a look under their seats right now, anyone who has a seat, sorry people who didn't get a seat, you missed out. Now, can you find a coloured sticker? Anyone got a coloured sticker? Put your hand up.
Thanks.
Coloured sticker. Oh, wow. Anything? Coloured sticker, hands up, or post-it note, or some sort of, oh, congratulations! You don't even know what you're going to win yet, and you're clapping. It might be something terrible. No, it's a free LIFX bulb. And after the event, please see Thomas. Thomas, can you raise your hand? Thomas over there. Please see Thomas after the event to collect your free light bulb. Okay. Next, we'd also like to thank NAB, who have very generously provided this fantastic venue for this evening's event. And here's NAB's Janet from Strategic Partnerships for Small Business, who'll give us a short intro to NAB. So thank you.
Thank you, and I'll be super, super brief. It's just a real pleasure to welcome you all and to this wonderful space that we call the Arena. And the reason we build spaces like this is to demonstrate our support to our customers in the community, and in this case, of course, to Startup Victoria and to Stripe. So it's really an honor to bring you all to this wonderful space. The other thing that I wanted to mention very quickly, another thing that we do is we've opened a co-working space in our building called The Village. I think many of you already know The Village. Many of you work from The Village, so I see a lot of Village members. So especially for the startup community, it is a place where our customers come to work. It's about the collaboration. It's about learning. All the events there are for free for our members. So I do want to have an open invitation for all of you to come and visit the Village, which is literally just at the end. So when you were walking here, if you saw a very colorful column, that's the Village. So I thought I'd just say and mention something about the Village today. But look, it's an absolute honor to welcome you all today to our space and support Startup Victoria and Stripe in the launch. So thank you. That's about it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Janet. Okay. So, Startup Victoria is very excited to help celebrate Stripe's official launch here in Australia today. So we'd like to thank Stripe's Head of Australia and New Zealand, Susan Wu, for her assistance in organising the event, and introduce her to the stage to say a few words.
Thank you, Michelle. As I look around the audience, I'm just so grateful that you guys have come out to help support our launch. And so on behalf of the Stripe team, thank you everyone in the Melbourne community for helping us feel so welcomed and part of the community here. I would like to especially thank NAB for being a great partner for us, and also for Square Peg Capital and Startup Victoria for helping welcome us into the Melbourne tech community with open arms. And also, I would like to introduce a couple of Stripe team members that are here. So Eduardo and James are in the corner. And so if you'd like to join us at the after party after this event, we'd be happy to talk to you about all things Stripe. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Susan. Okay. So now, please help me to welcome Stripe co-founder and President John Collison and local luminary Paul Bassat, who is the co-founder and president of Seek and Square Peg Capital, who will be hosting John for the Fireside Chat. So we won't be having a separate person, we'll be having the two of these guys. Now, questions will be toward the end, so these guys will just throw to the audience, and there'll be people with roving mics coming around to help you ask your questions. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to these guys. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Welcome to Melbourne.
Thanks. I was promised a fireplace.
Yeah, well, at least the weather reminds you of your original home.
Yeah. I'm originally from Ireland, and so Melbourne is doing a great Ireland impression right now.
Let's start at the beginning. When one of the things when a lot of people are looking at businesses trying to understand the problem that the business is solving, and you guys were founded, I think, in 2010, or certainly became sort of full-time involved in the business about 2010. So sort of 15, 16 years into the sort of the emergence of the e-commerce era, probably 12, 13 years after the founding of PayPal. What's the problem you guys are solving? I think the perspective of most people would be that the problem of payments had kind of largely been solved. What was different about your approach to payments, and what's the problem you guys are solving?
Yeah, it was always interesting pitching Stripe in the early days, because we were going to people and we're saying, again, this is 2010, and so 15 years into the emergence of the web, and we'd be like, it's a way to accept payments on the internet, and you get this kind of nonplussed look, But I think it was interesting, actually. One of our very early angel investors was Peter Thiel, one of the PayPal co-founders. And you think it's always going to be a bit awkward. You go in, you say to Peter Thiel, like, payments on the internet is completely broken. Who did that? But he totally got it. He really got the opportunity. And I think back in 2010, payments online was only kind of solved in the same way that, search was solved pre-Google. You had Lycos and Alta Vista and all these portals where you could go in and click around and visit one of 10 websites, or in the same way that hosting was solved, before cloud hosting providers like Amazon. If you had 3 full-time DevOps staff, sure, your life was great. I think the fact that we talk about how payments is one of the few really Google-sized problems left on the internet, in that it's so hard for you to send money around the world and run an online business. If you're before Stripe, if you were building something like a Dropbox or an Atlassian, sure, you have a way to charge credit cards, but now you need to build a way to kind of store customer payment details and build a billing engine to bill them on a monthly basis, and maybe you want to give them discounts, and so now you're building your own state tracking system for all, and suddenly you've got kind of a full-time payments engineer, and you're wondering, how did this happen? And so when it's as easy to move money around, when it's as easy to move money around the world as it is to move packets of information around the world, then I think we can call payments solved.
And how far, in terms of that journey, how far do you feel as though Stripe is along that journey, and what are the big gaps that you guys need to solve over the next few years?
We're still very early on that journey. We're kind of 1% of the way there. I think Stripe is starting to tackle that problem, but as you look at that problem I mentioned, say if you start a business accepting payments on the web today, and you're using Stripe, you kind of forget this, but you can accept payment from a minority of internet users, because most people simply don't have a credit card. And so you have people using credit cards in the Western world, you have M-Pesa, the mobile money system in Kenya, you have Alipay and Tenpay and China Union Pay in China, and so it's still really balkanized. There's no good unified way of moving money around.
Let's talk about Alipay for a moment. 500 million users, so that's, you guys announced a partnership with those folks I think in the last few weeks.
Yep.
Pretty big deal, I imagine, getting access to that sort of a user base. Do you want to just talk a little bit about China generally and the partnership with Alipay specifically?
Yeah, I think China's always been an intimidating country for businesses as they scale internationally. It's obviously very different in a number of ways, and one of those is that none of the payment mechanisms people are used to translate over there. And so this is our first step to start bridging that, where soon Stripe merchants will be able to sell not only accepting credit card payments but accepting Alipay payments. That I think. The fact that we're supporting this only goes to highlight kind of the extent of the problem and how far we have left to go. But it's a start. And this is what I mean about us being only 1% of the way there. There's other things as well where, we have this marketplaces product we're really excited about where you can not only charge money, but then send it to other people. And so if you're building a 99 Designs or if you're building an Uber or something like that, it's really easy to handle all the money flows. And even that still is only available in the United States. We're bringing it to more countries probably later this year. But, we're very much not done yet.
And just on Alipay specifically, in terms of their perspective, was there any resistance to them feeling as though, even though the business models are obviously very different, them having a very large existing user base, did they view you in any way as a competitor? Was there any resistance from them to partnering with Stripe?
No, I think if you look at it from Alipay's perspective, they have consumers inside China who are primarily spending money inside China today because those are the only sites that actually accept Alipay. Chinese consumers, they definitely would like to buy from sites outside China, and that's happening more and more, especially you look at a lot of Western brands kind of expanding into China with a retail presence. That hasn't really happened in the online world, mostly because the infrastructure isn't that good. And so for Alipay, this is about, for them, increasing the number of transactions that are flowing through the Alipay network, and for them it's a pretty natural kind of course of expansion.
And would a partnership with a company like M-Pesa or an organisation like M-Pesa, would that be a logical next step for Stripe?
Yeah, I think it would be super cool. I think you can't just develop one of these partnerships and call it done. In that if you allow people to accept money from buyers in Kenya, that's all well and good, but they have to actually have buyers in Kenya in the first place. And that means, is their product right for, attacking the Kenyan marketplace? Is it, are they able to kind of overcome language barriers, things like this? So you sometimes need to help create the market a little bit. But yeah, I think that'd be super cool.
The focus of the organisation a lot is around engineering-led solutions and helping engineers, and I think the language of the organisation is a lot around directed towards engineers within organisations, within customers, rather than sales and marketing folks. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that kind of what I think is perceived as very much a sort of an engineering-led strategy, if you like?
Yeah, part of it comes from our perspective and our background in that, before Stripe, myself and Patrick, my co-founder, we were engineers, we had built web services, and we were always really frustrated with how poor the tools available to us were. And so, for us, Stripe fundamentally is a better toolkit, it's a better SDK for moving money around. But I think as well, it's the way the world is going. It's, Stripe's core strength is that it's a better tool for the developers and engineers building payments into applications, building payments into websites. And we think the way the world is going is towards engineers having more and more leverage in what they do. You look at someone like I think it's super cool to look at Waze. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Israeli navigation company. And they basically beat Google at the in-car smartphone app navigation game. They beat Google at their own game and were bought by them for around $1 billion. And the fascinating thing is when they were bought, there were only around 100 people. And you think of kind of GPS navigation as one of the most labor-intensive things, one of the areas you definitely, as a young startup, don't want to go taking on Google. But they had this really innovative approach where they used the smartphone itself in the car to beam data back around traffic conditions and things like that. And so there you have, 100 really leveraged people inside a company having a massive impact. My other favorite example of this is WhatsApp. They were famously bought by Facebook for $19 billion. There were 55 people when that happened. And so 55 people had gotten to a user base of 500 million people. That 10 years ago was, I think, more or less completely unheard of, 55 people creating that much value. And so we think that trend is going to continue where a few really talented technology minds can affect that scale of change. And so Stripe is for them another tool of leverage. Stripe is for them about being able to build something much better if we give them that tooling.
Let's switch gears for a moment. You guys are Irish-born, educated, I think, did your tertiary education in the US. Mm-hmm. If you were still in Ireland, if you were in Dublin and founded Stripe, what difference do you think it would have made for you founding Stripe in Dublin rather than in San Francisco?
Yeah, I often wonder about that, and I don't know if I have all the answers. So the classic objection people, the classic kind of thing people talk about with local startup ecosystems, and the thing that especially in Ireland, one of the things that's constantly up for debate is the availability of early investment capital, the availability of seed capital or Series A or things like this. And I'm never quite sure what to make of that, because I know if we were actually in Boston for the first 8 months of Stripe, and when we wanted to raise money, we just hopped on a plane and went out to Silicon Valley. And so for me, as a startup, hopefully you're not spending your whole time fundraising, and so you probably can just go somewhere else if you need to fundraise. That should not really be an impediment to the development of a startup ecosystem. I think the things for us that were really beneficial about starting up in Silicon Valley as opposed to, say, Boston, where we were at the time, were that, one, we were actually really close to our customers, and so we stayed really uncomfortably close to our customers during the early iterations of Stripe. We would they would say, "Oh yeah, I'd like to integrate Stripe, but I can't quite find the time." And we'd be like, "Oh, come on, get out your laptop and we'll do it here. It'll only take 15 minutes." And before they knew it, they'd have it up and running on their site. And then getting the feedback from those customers, kind of being proximate to them, that was really useful. I think another thing is hiring. There's obviously a very significant number of engineers and kind of other people you'll want to hire for your startup available in Silicon Valley. And another factor that's less talked about is that people tend to be fairly risk tolerant in Silicon Valley. And so, you're trying to talk someone who has had a successful career up to now to join your band of hooligans on this completely unproven venture. And Silicon Valley, I don't know, maybe other places you can get people to do that as well, but I think that's one of the definite factors. It's not just, are those people there, but can you convince them to join this, what at the time looks like a totally ridiculous, risk.
Let's come back to the ridiculous risk. I mean, when you started Stripe, you were, how old? You were 20?
19.
19.
At the very beginning, yeah.
So still a teenager.
Yep.
I mean, what is it that makes someone who's sort of 19 have the sort of self-confidence to think you can found a global company? I mean, is it just something that's in the DNA? I imagine you probably didn't reflect on a lot. You probably just did it. But for a lot of people out here, obviously, are thinking about, have either got their own entrepreneurial ventures or thinking about their own entrepreneurial ventures. It's an audacious thing to think at 19 with your brother, you can found a global business. Do you want to just talk us through that thought process, if there was a thought process?
There wasn't a whole lot of thought process. People ask me questions sometimes like, how did you size the available market when you started with Stripe? And we're like, well, we wanted it, and so there's one customer, and great.
It's a good start.
But I think as well, there's this. There's totally this myth that goes around where people, take the narrative they've reached over 10 years and backport it onto the beginning. And so a great way to seem visionary is just to rewrite history and pretend that, the way things panned out 10 years later is how you always saw the future just unfolding like a mat.
So let's just talk about that. How did you see the future 5 years ago?
So quite differently in that I think when we were beginning, Stripe was this very tactical need for us in that Patrick and I had developed a subscription business online, and we had noticed that the infrastructure available for actually building the software, Ruby on Rails was really hot back then. It was just, the emergence of Node was just coming in. Even if we hadn't arrived at the right web frameworks, progress was being made so quickly, it was clear that we were on a good path. And similarly, things like cloud hosting infrastructure, if you wanted to develop a great product, the tools were all coming together there. When it came from, when you came to going from a product to a business, it was really hard. You were generally getting drowned in paperwork. You were dealing with multi-week setup processes, and once you had got everything set up, it didn't actually help you that much because, as I mentioned, maybe you're building a subscription business and now you have to go build your own subscription engine. And so we said, this clearly doesn't work. Let's try building our own version of it. And the initial insight was it was something where you would be able to instantly set up, get your API keys, integrate payments into your website or into your app. So we weren't trying to wrest control from you. We were happy kind of putting you at the front and center, and we would just be the background API. And that was the initial idea. That was what we had always wanted. We talked to one or two friends, they wanted it. And I think the thing that actually, when you mentioned kind of the self-confidence, I think one of the things that gave us because remember, we were working on this part-time in college at the time, and so, we might have just said, screw it, and gone back to studying. I think the thing that gave us reason to continue was that all the early users, those first 10 users, were extremely passionate about the product. So much so that, the next 10 or 20 users came from friends who they twisted our arm into inviting their friends. And so the way Stripe spread during the early days, it was in private beta for the first 2 years of its existence. And the way Stripe's spread through the early days was we actually had an invite system. I don't think you tend to think of like a payment infrastructure product as like the most viral product, like it's no Snapchat, but it actually spread entirely through an invite basis because that's how passionate people were about it. And so there's some maxim, I think it's Jason Fried or someone talking about, or maybe Paul Bassat, you want to make a very small number of people very happy rather than a large number of people moderately happy.
The private beta was, that's obviously a super long private beta, and most businesses would be kind of, really, sort of wanting to get out there, wanting to open it to the world. Was that mainly around wanting to make sure that your product was kind of, ready for the big stage, or was it partly a marketing strategy, knowing that if you could create that demand that was unfulfilled, that was the whole scarcity concept, that would make the product even more in demand with prospective customers?
Yeah, I'm not a marketer, and so I know you can do that with products where you artificially limit the demand and create buzz and start a hashtag campaign and whatever. That was not us. The reason it was in private beta for us was because it wasn't ready. We weren't happy with it. It didn't do kind of basic stuff that we thought was really important. We were still kind of building out those early financial relationships to actually make the product work. Because remember, we were coming at this. We were engineers and we had no experience in the payment space. I remember when we used to meet people in the early days, they would say very proudly that I've been in the payment space for 35 years, and I once tried to deadpan that. It didn't go over so well. So we had no experience in kind of financial services, and a lot of those first 2 years were us figuring out this completely alien world.
So let's talk about that. Do you think your lack of experience in the payment space was an advantage, or you think it was a disadvantage that you've been able to overcome?
It definitely made things take longer because we were just figuring out how the world worked. But I think fundamentally it was a pretty core advantage in that part of, I think, people who had worked in payments for a really long time had been kind of so entrenched in that world that they were unable to see, from an outsider's perspective, which is all their potential customers, they were unable to see how broken it was. And so they were unable to put themselves in the customer's shoes. And I think that goes for lots of things. Everyone likes talking about Elon Musk. And I think part of what made SpaceX so powerful was that he was one of the few people not in the old boys defense contracting club that made their money selling these ridiculously expensive defense contracts to the US government.
Yeah.
And he was able to come in and say, you should be able to send things into space for much cheaper than this.
And you had the three guys most closely associated with PayPal. There was a bunch of founders, but you've got Peter Thiel, Elon and Max Levchin as shareholders, and there's a lot of stories about the relationship between the three of them. I know that particularly between Peter and Elon, there was a bit of tension and stuff like that in the early days of PayPal. Do you want to just talk a little bit about pitching to those guys and particularly difficult exercise pitching to guys who know a hell of a lot about the space and founded what was until then the most successful company in payments.
Yeah, I think, like I said, the cool thing about pitching those guys was, by and large, pitching Stripe was an uphill battle to get people to understand it and understand why it was needed. We'd go in and tell people that we were letting people accept payments online, and their eyes would glaze over. They would just assume this was a solved problem. Whereas Peter, Elon, and Max, they all got it, and they all got it instantly. I think their early vision of PayPal, when they were there between 98 and 2002, was kind of similar to this. A universal network for payments online to allow anyone in any country to kind of seamlessly interact economically with anyone else. And that quite simply just hasn't come to pass. And if you look at kind of the most successful apps and services today, they don't use PayPal for the payments. And so I think they would really like to see that vision come to pass. And so that's what they were excited about.
And I imagine you pitched to one of them first and they kind of got on the phone and said, you've got to meet these guys and they've got a great story to tell. How did that come about? You went to one of them first?
Yeah, it was Peter who invested first. He was our most significant. He was our first significant angel investor, and the rest kind of came along later. So.
I've got to ask you, working with your older brother, I had that experience for 14 years. I had the one advantage that we had a third co-founder, so he was sort of a referee.
The mediator, yeah.
He was the mediator. And do you want to just talk about your experience? I mean, it's obviously a wonderful thing where you obviously know each other incredibly well, know your strengths and weaknesses. I'm sure there's an implicit level of trust that is incredibly important in a startup. Do you want to just talk about some of the benefits of co-founding with your brother, but also some of the challenges?
Yeah, I think I sometimes meet people or talk to people who've gone to these co-founder speed dating events or something like this, where you talk to someone for 2 minutes and co-found a company with them, and that always seems really terrifying to me. But maybe I'm like way too far on the other end of the spectrum. I think when you're working with someone on a company, you're working kind of, especially in the early days, 15-hour days. A lot of decisions made on gut feel, and just you gotta instinct. You have to agree on a lot of stuff. And you want to have a very high level of trust and ability to work together, just because there isn't time for, there's so much to do, there isn't time to sort out all that other stuff. It really is a very close working relationship. And so I don't think you have to be brothers for that to be the case, but I think it's good to be able to work effectively together. I don't think all sets of brothers have that, and so, if you don't, maybe you should find someone else to start a company with. But in myself and Patrick's case, we had actually started a company together before Stripe, and so we knew what the dynamic was, and we knew it worked pretty well for us.
So do you want to just talk about, one of the things that I think we learnt on the way in our journey, and probably sort of 12, 18 months in, learnt the importance of having pretty clear areas of responsibility of the three of us, and particularly for that was particularly important for the rest of the team. So there's real clarity for them about who people reported to, what decision processes look like, not having to kind of go to person one, then person two, then person three to sell something, and just having real clarity. How does it work? How does it work with you and Patrick in terms of your areas of responsibility? Do you kind of divide it up functionally, geographically? Just gravitate to areas that you're each more interested in? How does it work?
Yeah, I think you're right in that in the early days, there's just like this big lump of work, and you kind of both attack it, and it works great. As the company grows in size, you really have to kind of start splitting responsibilities so that people aren't confused. Ben Horowitz has this. He's an investor at Andreessen Horowitz, and he has this good anecdote about any time people come in and they claim they're co-CEOs, they say to them that, okay, so just to clarify here, you're planning on being co-CEOs, and so you're planning on making everything confusing for all your employees today and all the employees you will ever hire, and make them go with decisions to both of you and never quite understand where they stand, just so you guys don't have to have an awkward conversation right now. And that always kind of stops people in their tracks a little bit. And so I think, right now, kind of the way we split it up is Patrick will work a little closer with the product side of things. I'll work with the sales team a bit more. You can never quite split it up evenly in that there'll always be things like recruiting. Everyone at the company should be recruiting all the time, basically. Like I probably spend maybe 30% of my time on recruiting, and I think that'll be true for everyone. But some things, you definitely do want to split so that just people know how they're structured.
When you and I chatted last week or the week before, and you talked about the fact that, and I'll paraphrase you and I'll get it wrong, so correct me, but you talked about the fact that if you can kind of, win a customer from a competitor, that's kind of nice. Mm-hmm. But what's much more exciting for you guys is a newly formed business where you're kind of empowering them to help build their business. That kind of motivates you guys much more. There was a real sense of purpose and sense of mission to what you're doing. Can we just sort of talk about that theme in a sort of a broad sense? I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me about a lot of great entrepreneurs is it is really about a sense of purpose. It's really about a sense of mission. It's really about changing the world in a particular way, as opposed to I'm going to sell a widget that lots of people are going to buy and I'm going to become really rich. Yeah. Do you want to just reflect on that a little bit and just get your thoughts around the difference between those two approaches and whether that's just a matter of semantics or whether it really is a substantive difference?
No, I think that is right in that I think it's actually kind of important for companies to have to be able to clearly elucidate the positive impact they're having on the world, and I'll get back to why in a second. But the way we think about it is if we're just, getting people to move over from a competitor to Stripe and kind of stirring up the existing pot but not really changing things, that's not actually that interesting. The global e-commerce market, coming up with these figures always involves a heavy dose of making up numbers, but people generally put it around $1 trillion, which sounds like a big figure, but isn't actually that big. Around 2% of consumer spending globally happens online right now. You can kind of argue about where that should end up, but it's clear, based on the time we all spend kind of online or on our phones or whatever, that we're an order of magnitude off there. We're going to end up with a very significant portion of our spend online. And again, part of what is holding that back is that it's so hard to start moving money online. It's traditionally been so restricted and so difficult to start working with. We think, if Stripe is successful, and like I said, we're very early on our journey still, but if Stripe is successful, we will make it so much easier for people to start building online businesses and kind of connecting people all over the world economically that will actually move that needle. The reason I think it's important for people to be able to kind of elucidate and kind of explain how they're improving the world is because I think increasingly people want to work for companies where that's the case. It's a very competitive market out there. You're trying to attract co-founders, you're trying to attract employees, and also, you're just kind of sitting back and reflecting on what you're doing. I think it's actually, in a sense, easier to work on the really worthwhile stuff because you have the wind at your back, as opposed to, if you're building a company that, scams old people out of money, you're going to have a much harder time.
Yeah. I remember one of the first times I was online, it was 1995. I won't ask you how old you were in 1995, but we can all do the maths. I was very young, by the way. And I saw what subsequently found out was a banner ad. I didn't really know what a banner ad was, but I saw what was sort of subsequently found out was a banner ad, and it was an ad for Earth's largest bookstore, which was obviously Amazon. And I went onto Amazon, and I was really blown away by the fact that kind of you could buy pretty much any title and the availability of books. It's like a lot of people, their first experience with the internet, I was really blown away. But I guess the point is that at some point, Bezos got bored with that vision. He clearly achieved that vision, building the Earth's biggest bookstore, but he got bored of that.
Except for Hachette titles.
Yeah, this is true. And he got a little bit bored of that and started selling CDs, and then, of course, web services and a bunch of different things.
Drones.
Drones, which is kind of, I think, is really out there. But has done a bunch of different things that, has kind of, that vision has changed quite dramatically from that original vision. And that vision was probably their first 4 or 5 years. I think they were just selling books. in that context, talk about what you think, you guys might be doing 10 years from now. And it's probably an unfair question.
Yeah.
But that's okay. I mean, they can't all be easy questions.
Yeah, right. I do think this is kind of an interesting phenomenon, right? Which is, Amazon starts out with a mission to be the Earth's largest bookstore, and then actually pretty quickly they're the Earth's largest bookstore. And it's like, well, what do we do now? Do we close up shop and go home? And so no, they instead get into every other thing you could possibly buy. And so I think their mantra for a while was the everything store. That's the name of the new Brad Stone book, which is about Amazon. But of course, doing web services doesn't even quite fit there. And so you have to just keep providing, at your annual meeting, you look at the mission and say, well, does this actually reflect what we're doing? I think Google is another example where they started off, we're going to build really good search. And then they noticed they could do all other really cool things like mail sucked. So we built this really awesome mail client, and we, for some reason, acquired this mapping company and this analytics company and stuff. And so you're like, we need some kind of unifying thread for all this. And so you're like, we're going to organize the world's information. That's really nice in general, right? And so it would be hard to do things that don't fit under that umbrella. And so we'll get away with that one for a while. But then you start building blimps that carry internet, and you start building self-driving cars, and you're like, screw it, who cares? And so, right,
So they're organising the world rather than just organising the world's information.
I think they're just doing stuff, they're just writing code at this stage. That could be their motto.
Sort of A-class shares and B-class shares and controlling the votes. It's a good strategy.
I think Google's an interesting company because, there are all these companies over time like GE and Siemens and Samsung, and they're just general purpose engineering companies. Like Samsung, I don't think a lot of people know, but in Korea, they do a whole lot of building work and things like this. I think I heard the stat, I'm almost certain this is right, that they, at least at one point, were 20% of Korea's GDP, which is a staggering number. Same with Siemens. And I think Google is kind of a company that's a candidate for heading in this direction, where
20% of the world's GDP instead of 20% of the country.
They're just a company that whose specialty is building really good, writing really good software. In terms of Stripe, I think we are lucky in that when we talk about, building, unifying the world's financial infrastructure and making it so that it's easy for anyone to accept payment from anyone, anywhere else, I think we got a bit of runway there. I'm not looking over my shoulder worried that, tomorrow we're going to completely solve that problem and we're going to have to come up with a new vision. I think there are interesting things down the road that if we were to solve all that, we could start branching out into, but we're not going to.
Such as?
I think there are other things adjacent to that in business that are still really hard for people. And so if you look at what are the gating factors for me starting a business right now, say I'm LIFX. I think actually LIFX is a really awesome product. One thing I didn't realize until recently was that the founders didn't really have a ton of hardware or manufacturing experience before LIFX. They were just having a discussion and be like, wouldn't it be cool if there was a bulb, but you could control it from your phone because it was Wi-Fi in the bulb? And I think we've all had those kind of conversations, but not that many of us have had super successful Kickstarter campaigns and actually gone and manufactured. And I've seen it. It's really bright. It's really good. It's a great quality for a bulb. But
depending on what sort of mood you want to set, but you can turn it down, I guess. So bright is good.
Exactly. Yeah. The invention of the dimmer switch, very important. So if you're LIFX and you want to start getting that in the hands of people globally, payments is going to be one gating factor, making sure you can actually accept money for the for this product. But there's going to be other things, right? There's going to be the fact that there's different tax regimes in all these countries. There's the fact that fulfillment is going to be really expensive and sometimes prohibitive. Customs getting the goods into the countries, and same with digital goods and services as well, right? Actually localizing your product for the Brazilian market or the Chinese market or something like that. That's what, in a sense, prevents so many companies from going international. Because when you look at any company and you see that 80% of their sales comes from Australia and 20% of their sales comes from the rest of the world, you got to ask yourself: is that because this is fundamentally a product that's much better suited to the Australian market, and it's only really something that's relevant to Australians, or is it that it's actually a pretty globally, relevant product, and just for some reason it's not doing that well in other markets. And if the latter, which is usually the answer, then that means there's an inefficiency there, and you could help solve that.
Let's talk about building a global business, and there's kind of a sort of I guess a speed versus effectiveness, for want of a better term, trade-off. If you think about the car industry, for example, the manufacturers, probably for reasons of lack of capital, went out and established dealership networks. And you kind of look now 80 years later, and most car manufacturers make no money, but the dealerships do really well. They make a shitload of money. If you were setting up an airline in the early part of the 20th century, you weren't very smart. But if you were building an airport, you were really, really clever.
If you were building a duty-free shop, you were cleverer still.
And you're building a duty-free, absolutely. And I mean, the story of the sort of the emergence of duty-free business in sort of in the post-war period, and a lot of it was to service US returning servicemen and that sort of thing. So, kind of decisions you're making now, assuming that this is a business that's been built to last for the next 50 or 100 years, you guys are going to make decisions now that are going to have very, very long-term implications. Coca-Cola, another example, obviously went down the path of awarding license to bottlers. And the Coca-Cola company's been able to keep a very, very big chunk of the profits, unlike in the car industry, where the dealers have kept most of the profits, and other parts of the value chain have kept most of the profits. How do you think about building out a global organisation? And you're an organisation, I think, of 130 people. Yeah. It's a big world out there, but if you don't do it quickly, other people are going to kind of steal a march, in the same way that Yahoo did in Japan, vis-a-vis eBay as an example.
So I actually think this is a really interesting question, and it kind of comes down to when you're building a global business, you have to decide what it is you outsource and what it is core, and where the lines of demarcation lie. Because if you think of any global business that has been very successful, you actually pretty quickly find that they have a very clear idea of what is their core competency, and a lot of other things they ruthlessly outsource. So Coca-Cola, like you mentioned, I mean, the two things they basically control are the brand and marketing and the recipe. Everything else is given to other people. And so, you take a Coke here and you look at the bottle, and it's going to be bottled by some local company that was granted the franchise. Coca-Cola doesn't want any part in the, getting that into stores, or, actually the production. That Coke itself is manufactured locally here. They're not taking part in the manufacturing. And so they have decided that to build a really successful global business, that's how they get to scale, and that's how they win. Another kind of interesting example for me here is Hotel Tonight, which is an app. I don't know if you guys have used it, but it kind of does what it says in the tin, in that it's an app you open and you tap a button and you have a hotel room for that night. But I've noticed now that if I need to travel and I'm maybe not staying in an Airbnb, I'll open Hotel Tonight and kind of book the first thing available. They're heavily discounted, but now my loyalty has shifted, from it's not with any particular hotel chain, it's now with the app itself, in that, I'm staying in Hotel Tonight, and the service happens to be fulfilled by this company. And so they have decided that the really valuable brand, the really valuable piece to own is the app and the booking experience, and actually who manages the hotel and who employs all the people, that's less important. And if you're a hotel, that's terrifying, right? Because they've spent decades building up this brand, and now you're potentially being competed with by a few guys building it up.
So let's talk about that for a second. So you can be the incumbent for a moment instead of the challenger. What would you do? Because it is terrifying, because I mean, ownership for any business, owning the customer is critically important. And hotels have done a bunch of things around trying to maintain that customer relationship, particularly around loyalty programs, and as have airlines and those sorts of things. How do you respond to Hotel Tonight if you're a hotel chain?
It's tough in that, and I think some of these companies kind of have backed themselves into these corners where the classic example everyone likes to complain about is airline booking websites, where, it turns out that the flow for booking an airline ticket is really important. And if you've made it so hard for so long and kind of ignored the emergence of the internet, then things like, Hipmunk and Kayak and Travelocity will come along, and they will like gobble the customer away from you, and now you're just a service provider. I don't know. I think the hotel that figures out how to solve this will do pretty well.
Sounds like you prefer being a disruptor than an incumbent.
Yeah.
We got some questions from community members, and it might be worth picking up a couple of them, and then we'll go to questions from the audience shortly. One I think was particularly thought-provoking, which was around Silicon Valley encouraging the best and brightest of our generation to solve problems that only are felt by the middle class, and that they're providing solutions that help 10% of society. Do you want to get your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think this is actually a very reasonable thing to be worried about, is that, we solve problems for people like us, and so if we come from a fairly privileged background, we'll kind of solve problems for people of our own background, and you kind of, there's a large swathe of the population that you ignore. Jeff Hammerbacher, who's the Cloudera CEO, had a great line on this, where he talked about how the best minds of my generation are focused on how to make people click ads, which I thought was kind of a pithy way of putting it.
Or make golf balls go another 5 meters further, or that sort of thing.
This kind of thing, yeah. And you hear all these examples. Like, did you guys hear about Yo, the app that you press you press a button on your phone and it sends a message saying Yo to another person, and they raise $1.5 million in funding. That's it. That's the story.
$500,000 a letter.
Yeah. And there's other examples. People talk about, again, WhatsApp being acquired by Facebook for $19 billion. But I think there's kind of a bit of an availability bias here, where you only hear about the most egregious examples, right? You hear about Yo getting funding, and you don't hear about, there's a company called Theranos in Silicon Valley, which does blood diagnostics on your iPhone, and they've raised $400 million to date. The founder was 19 when she started working on it. She's now 30. The company is worth $9 billion. It's worth $9 billion. They're like revolutionizing blood diagnostics, and no one really talks about it because it's less fun to talk about than Yo. And you can just go down the list and kind of see interesting things like this. Even WhatsApp, which I think people like to trot out as an example of like a fairly frivolous thing. What was revolutionary about WhatsApp is it basically replaced SMS to people. And if you look at where WhatsApp was most popular, it was in, reasonably poor countries like India, where the cell phone providers had previously been charging these extortionate rates, and they just came along and used, the fact that people had smartphones to completely eliminate, $100 billion of carrier revenue earned through SMS. Google, which is, everyone's favorite example of just kind of the ad machine, they're now actually doing pretty worthwhile stuff. They have the self-driving car project, which will help a lot of people who can't drive today get around. They have, I don't know if you guys have seen, they're developing this is what I mean about they have to move away from organizing the world's information. They're developing a contact lens that analyzes your tiers for glucose content, so that diabetics can monitor their glucose content without having to be like continuously pricking themselves. And so, the skeptical view of Google is that they're working on all these, shiny projects in the corner to just distract people from the fact that they're an ad engine. The charitable view of Google is that they're a company that takes, ad money from large brands and funnels it into the research and development of all these really interesting long-term projects. So it depends on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist.
Whenever, sort of movie stars or bands come to Melbourne or to Australia, they're always asked, what do you think about Melbourne? What do you think about Australia? And the answer is always, this is fantastic. I love Australia. It's my favourite place. And
I love Australia.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit like, I don't know if people saw the YouTube video of President Obama is talking about, it was with about a succession of about 12 different world leaders, and there's, the United States has no greater friend than Austria. The United States has no greater friend than Australia, and so on. But just talk a little bit about one of the things that we always want to hear people's perspectives on and understand it's a 30,000 foot view, but talk about your perspective on the tech ecosystem in this market, in this part of the world. You're in the privileged position that you get to see a lot of different markets. You're very integrated into the I think 17 countries you're in now or thereabouts. Talk about your perspectives of this market, but specifically around what do you think are the key ingredients that distinguish a Tel Aviv from an Ulaanbaatar or wherever Ulaanbaatar is?
In general, I think there's pretty good reason to be. I don't think it's that healthy for the world for Silicon Valley to be this kind of place that has a monopoly on tech innovation. And I think there's actually pretty good reason to believe that that's becoming, it's becoming increasingly spread out. Like I mentioned, you're getting to a point where a team of 50 or a team of 100 talented people can, completely disrupt a market and own a segment, whereas before you might have had to hire 1,000 or 10,000 people, and hiring 50 of the right people is a much less daunting proposition than hiring 1,000 of the right people. You have the Waze in Israel, you have Spotify being developed in Stockholm, you have Skype being developed. I don't even remember her Skype. I think Estonia. And more and more of these, even like really specialized problems, the V8 engine, which is what makes Chrome, the web browser, really fast, is developed in Denmark by a team of really specialized engineers there. And so I think we're getting to a point where small teams can have really, really high impacts and can form a really successful company. That's obviously not the only thing that matters. Like I said, I think the jury's still out a bit on how much the availability of capital affects things, because certainly there are plenty of problems where you do need outside capital for them to get going quickly. Otherwise, it's going to be a very slow.
But let me ask you. Let's say you're talking to some folks here, or you're talking to some young guys in Dublin who are thinking about setting up a company. Would you be saying to them, look, obviously it's going to depend on what we're doing a little bit, but are you going to say to them, look, I think at some point you're going to need to get on a plane and set yourself up in Palo Alto or set yourself up in San Francisco? Or because, you talked about the 50 people at WhatsApp, but those 50 people happen to be in I can't remember if they're in the Valley of San Francisco, but they're in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And most of the great companies that have been formed in the last 10 or 15 years have been formed in that part of the world. I mean, there is a self-perpetuating nature to it. And the companies you mentioned, Waze and Spotify, they've moved a chunk of their people, not all of their people, to the Valley. I mean, what is it that needs to happen to change that paradigm a little bit? And is it important that it changes?
Yeah, it's funny you mention if I'm talking to a friend in Dublin. I actually was talking to a friend in Dublin recently, and he started a company there, and it's sort of interesting. They're split roughly 50-50 between Dublin and San Francisco, and so their answer to this question is both. And again, that's something that wasn't really a runner 10 or 20 years ago, because the collaboration tools were so much less mature. Like, we rely pretty heavily at Stripe right now on instant message and Google Hangouts and things like that, and it's actually pretty. We have people in San Francisco and London spread out all across the US, and the whole setup works pretty well. And so I think we're seeing a lot of really successful distributed teams. The question of, should you set up in Melbourne or should you have people in Silicon Valley? I think it's pretty reasonable that you especially if you're doing, say, a lot of sales to Silicon Valley companies or things like that, you're on a plane a lot, you have people based there. I think we may move towards a world where there isn't a single answer.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't we go to questions from the audience? I'm sure there's a bunch of questions that people would like to ask. And I think we've got some roving microphones. There's a question at the front.
Thanks very much. So how have your perspectives on regulation, security, compliance, that sort of stuff shifted over time? And what can startups, specifically ones in the cryptocurrency space, where it's a hot topic, what can we learn from your experience?
One thing I think that's kind of interesting is that startups tend to view compliance, security, all that kind of stuff as all here be dragons territory, and it's all bad. Whereas in fact, one of the things that really helped us get started with Stripe was the fact that credit card security regulations were pretty onerous. In the 2000s, there were so many breaches of credit card data. It was a new thing where you would have databases of millions of credit cards that someone could just a Hamburglar could just run off with in the middle of the night, and so the credit card companies developed these fairly strict rules and regulations around the storage of credit card numbers. And so now if you're a big business and you want to accept credit cards, suddenly you're having auditors in your office to make sure everything's legit. And so one of the things that Stripe offered is that we would let you accept credit cards on your website, but actually all the processing of the credit cards would, the credit cards would go straight to our server. You would never be handling the credit card data yourself, and we would take that off your plate. And so we kind of took the scary compliance security world and turned it into an advantage, because it turned out, we were a startup that was kind of leery of it, but every other startup was too. And so I think this is kind of true of say, as you mentioned, cryptocurrency startups as well, right? Where one of the advantages that a lot of the wallet companies provide is the fact that they store most of your Bitcoin offline, things like this. I don't want to be storing Bitcoin myself on my hard drive because that's pretty fragile, and so it's not solely a detractor as a startup.
It's a lady sort of midway. Oh, sorry.
So how does...
Only the front row can ask questions, so everyone's going to have to move forward.
You guys can go home.
So how does Stripe deal with things like chargeback fraud? Do you have the same problems as PayPal in the early days, or do you have things like limits on risky merchants?
Yeah, so chargebacks, if people use a stolen credit card to buy something or something like this, the cardholder will charge back the transaction, they'll get their money back. This is a problem for, this tends to be a problem for honest merchants if people are using stolen credit cards to buy goods and services from them. And this can be a problem for, a company like Stripe itself, where there's fraudulent merchants buying from Stripe, setting up on Stripe. With the fraudulent merchants, we've developed a handful of screening processes to weed them out. I think one of the, again, things that we did that gave us a competitive advantage was that before, all this stuff was done manually. You were, filling out your paperwork by hand, shipping it off to a bank, and it would slowly work its way through the Rube Goldberg underwriting machine, and hopefully come out after a few weeks at the other end. We decided, it should be possible to do all this in real time, and so people were able to kind of more or less for the first time get instant access to, to an online payment API. They thought that was really cool. For the merchant fraud piece, where merchants are worried about fraudulent buyers, again, this is something that you can, if you play your cards right, turn into a strength. Where we've developed a set of machine learning technologies and things like this, such that merchants aren't having to go and weed out fraudulent orders by hand themselves. They can rely on Stripe to do it, and now you've taken something that was a risk and turned it into a selling point.
You mentioned that you're set up for dealing with engineers as your typical audience. I wonder about the challenge of crossing the chasm from going and dealing with early adopters through to the early stage majority by working with users or decision makers rather than users.
Yeah, well, I think one is we're increasingly seeing that developers are getting to, if not be the decision makers, at least have a fairly active voice in the decision. Because when you look at people kind of building apps and services, the implementation cost and the implementation time frame is a pretty significant factor. And so I think we're moving away from a world of the totally hierarchical, PowerPoint-driven sales presentation, and more towards people actually looking at the quality of the tool or service they're buying. But also, it's true that it's not just the case that the only sales material Stripe has is our API documentation, and if you don't want to read that, you're out of luck. I think we have come to be able, the people who care about cloud hosting are not just the DevOps people. People also like, the finance team also like being able to, not having to buy a bunch of servers up front. And so it's the same with Stripe, where there is, a core technology advantage, but you have to be good at communicating that to a whole variety of audiences.
Every single startup needs to go through a pivot. Has Stripe went any, either minor or major pivot since it started?
We are pre-pivot, which I guess is kind of terrifying, right? What's our pivot going to be? No, I think we maybe tweaked during the early days rather than pivoted. We made small changes, but the use of Stripe today looks more or less like the use of Stripe 4.5 years ago.
Okay, so I've actually got your typical questions, like looking back, is there something that you would not have done, or some mistakes you think you give us some thoughts on to avoid? And also, what do you think you're really, really happy you did? That's two things. If I could just add another third one, is you made a good point I liked was it's really good to make a small group of people really happy. What then was your tipping point?
Tipping point as in?
Making a big group happy. So.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to work backwards through those questions. I guess we initially made the very first version of Stripe was actually pretty technical, and so people who were really comfortable working, with the code at a bare metal level themselves, they were really happy to finally have access to the infrastructure they wanted. But for anyone else, it was actually quite intimidating to use. And so our major kind of broadening was going from, the really hardcore set of engineers to making it really easy to drop in. For the first version, implementing Stripe was, still an undertaking. You were still writing a decent amount of code, and it was only maybe 2 years later we got to the point where you could drop in a few lines of JavaScript, and that was all you needed to get up and running. Oh yeah. Highs and lows of Stripe. I think one thing we're really happy in retrospect that we did, and whenever you talk about people and hiring, it's people tend to get into cliches, and I'll try really hard to stay away from those. But we've hired fairly slowly throughout Stripe, and that might sound kind of funny because we're 130 people now, which seems on the face of it kind of big. But what I mean by we've hired slowly is we've always been very willing to just simply not hire for a role and leave it unfilled rather than settle and be willing to compromise. And I think that's actually really important, because if you're looking at it from a really long-term perspective, if you're looking at assembling the best team over a 5 or 10 year time horizon, I mean, sure, you can settle now and hire a warm body, but that is going to affect your ability to recruit down the line. We look at hiring like a tree, and so when you're hiring a person, you're not just hiring them, but you're hiring the next 10 people after them. I remember this when we were hiring our graphic designer. It took us a year to find the right person, and so for that intervening year, Stripe was just really ugly. I have screenshots I can dig up, but man, it was not good. But again, we prefer to be ugly for that year, but have the right designer over the next, many years, than settle immediately. And of course, then if you make a good hire for the initial person in that role, they're going to affect the quality and the caliber of people you can recruit after that. And so I think that's possibly something that people don't pay enough attention to. Is you are not hiring on a role by role basis. You're kind of gradually corralling people into this, nebulous sphere, and your ability to directly influence hires actually decreases as the group grows in size. And so you better really hope that you're doing a good job of those early highs. Well, you asked also about kind of low points or regrets. I mean, there are plenty of kind of tactical errors, all of which are pretty small. I could probably bore everyone and name 1,000 if I was left long enough. There aren't any really significant errors that come to mind. But of course, there's there's a selection bias here where, I'm up on stage and, the version of Stripe that disastrously misstepped and is nowhere to be found now is not. And so, I probably, Stripe is, either lucky or skilled. I think, probably mostly lucky to have made it this, this far and through, this many rounds of executions without having gotten the chop. And so there's no major lows I can that spring to mind.
How did you kind of talk about time in the early stages?
That's actually that's the first time someone's asked that question. I think it's a pretty worthwhile one. How do we carve out time for big thinking? Big thinking. It's kind of like big data. It's a great buzzword. So I think in the early days, you just kind of do it as part of your natural flow. In that, I remember when Stripe was 4 people, we would go to lunch together, we would go to dinner together. I would characterize us as, rather than going flat out all the time, we were working at maybe kind of 60% capacity all the time. Like we worked more or less 7 days a week in the early days, but we worked at a much easier pace. As the company's grown in size, things just naturally get busier and there's kind of more external demands and internal demands, and so you tend to work for kind of more constrained amount of time, but harder during those hours. The way we do it now, I don't think it's perfect, but it works pretty well. We'll take a weekend or an evening and kind of carve it out explicitly to go work on larger stuff. So there's no kind of answering emails. There's none of the like day-to-day tactical stuff. It's explicitly, okay, what do we want to do for the next 6 months? It's funny. I was in Tamales Bay, which is a place just north of San Francisco, working on this a few weekends recently. And then on the flight over here, I was reading the book by the Pixar guy. It's called Creativity Inc. By Ed Catmull, and it's basically his history of life at Pixar. And in one of the chapters, he describes how when they were planning a new movie, just in the very, very beginning, they had this house in Tamales Bay they used to go up to, and they would like whiteboard what the movie would be about. And so apparently, us and Pixar have basically the same long-term planning process. That Pixar book is really good, by the way. If anyone is looking for a book recommendation.
Can I ask, over here, a question about payments more generally? When we speak of online payments, we generally think of small transaction values, particularly in the B2C space. There appears to be a whole market that isn't touched by online payments, particularly medium-sized transactions, say over $1,000. And my yardstick is what PayPal's average transaction amount is, which in Q2 of 2014 was around $65. We're seeing consumers moving to online platforms to advertise things like vehicles and larger transaction items, high-ticket items. Do you see the existing online payment infrastructure as being suitable to deal with those types of transactions, or is something else required?
That's an interesting question, it's also it's kind of eerie how everyone's average transaction size kind of shakes out in roughly the same place. In that PayPal's is there, Square's is there, ours is kind of roughly around that amount. I think that if your question is, are credit cards well suited to doing $10,000 transactions, I think kind of empirically no, in that people prefer to invoice them or something like that. One of the things we recently launched in the US is beta support for direct bank account transfers, and so you collect someone's bank account details and you can then do a debit from that. We're still figuring out what exactly the right product experience is there, because everyone's expectations around moving money, when it comes to bank accounts is different. Like, for one, when you give someone a check, your bank account details are on it right there, and so you kind of don't expect when you give someone a check them to be able to withdraw arbitrary amounts of money from your bank account. But that's kind of how we think about the problem, is that we have very widely adopted financial instruments today like, the direct bank transfer networks, like wires, like credit cards, things like that. We want to give people access to all that infrastructure, and then people will kind of mix and match them as makes most sense. I think one thing that's cool is the idea that for people who are charging very large amounts of money, they can cut their fees by switching over to bank payments, and we think that would be a totally cool thing to enable.
Stuart Stoyan here from Moneyplace. If I think about peer-to-peer lending, that initially started out as the peer-to-peer lenders versus the banks. But now we're seeing Lending Club is partnering with Union Bank and other banks. Funding Circle's done something similar in the UK. What about Stripe? How do you see Stripe working with the existing banks or payments providers?
Sorry, to do lending specifically?
Oh, no, just in terms of partnering with payments providers and existing, as opposed to disintermediating, partnering with banks.
Yeah. So, I mean, we do partner a decent amount today, and I think the ways in which we partner today will kind of be how we do so in future. So there's two ways. One is, I mean, Stripe itself is, the way we enable access to the credit card networks is we work with, large financial partners like NAB, who we're really lucky to work with to make that happen. And so I think, we will continue to, these banks fundamentally have built the rails. I think what's powerful about Stripe is it makes, you have this really powerful API for now baking that into an application, which didn't really exist before. The second way we're going to partner is things like Alipay. I can see us doing more like that in the future, where there's a very large consumer base that isn't addressed by credit cards. We totally should partner with the payment companies who are addressing those consumers so that people can accept payment from a very broad set of consumers. That's kind of how I think about it.
So John, thank you. Two questions, I guess. One, what do you think of things like social platforms? Do you think social commerce will take off? And the likes of, digital wallets, the iTunes of the world, will they come and slowly creep up and start eating your lunch? And then secondly, what are your thoughts on some of the value-added services? If at some point payment becomes a commodity, how else would you differentiate to stay number one?
So there's kind of three questions there. One is social commerce, two is digital wallets, and three is payments becoming a commodity. So on social commerce, it seems pretty cool. It's kind of unproven yet, but Facebook recently announced using your Facebook credentials to pay for purchases. I think one of the biggest problems that people are facing today is the identity problem. The fact that every new website you go to, you have to type in all your details again. And I mean, it's crazy when you think about it. Imagine if you went to buy a coffee and they hand you a clipboard and you studiously write out where you live and whatever, and then it rejects the transaction because you moved house recently and whatever. I mean, the whole thing is crazy, but that's where we're at on the internet. We're still using the internet analog of the mail order form in 2014. Well done. And so if Facebook can solve that by leveraging all their accounts on file, that'd be awesome. It's interesting you call out digital wallets, because I think one of the things is that I notice is that digital wallets have kind of crept up on us without anyone noticing. Peter Norvig talks about how artificial intelligence is kind of a cursed term because it always refers to the hand-wavy future stuff. We have specific names for artificial intelligence like self-driving cars or chessbots or image classification. And so artificial intelligence is the term reserved for things that will never come to pass. I think it's a little bit like that with digital wallets, where you have things like Uber and Lyft and Halo, where you get out of the car at the end of the ride and payment is magically taken care of from your phone. It knows who you are. It knows who the driver is. It has your card on file, and poof, the payment just happened. That sounds an awful lot like a digital wallet to me, but everyone's waiting for the magic tappy thing. And so digital wallets, I think, are more or less already here. Airbnb is a digital wallet, Uber is a digital wallet, Hotel Tonight is a digital wallet, and we're going to continue to see these apps and services gobbling up transactions that are happening in the offline space. And they also, let's not forget, these digital wallets actually make the product experience as a whole better. I left my iPad in a cab recently, and I was really annoyed because it was a cab that was kind of no getting it back. Even if the driver wanted to return it to me, they had no way of knowing. And that doesn't really happen with Uber because you know exactly who the driver is and you can just give them a ring. And so you have these digital wallets that are both emerging and making the product experience as a whole better. That's really cool. In answer to your last question, whether payments is a commodity, I mean, I think the stuff that Stripe is already doing is not necessarily payments. It's helping people run their whole business. You know, it's like if you're a marketplace, you use Stripe to charge people and then send the money to the third-party sellers. If you're running a subscription business, rather than building your own subscription engine, you're managing all that with Stripe. And so, I mean, I think credit card processing itself is kind of already a commodity, and people have known that for a while, which is why we always look to, you know, for other problems to solve for people.
Hi. So I've heard it said sometimes that companies' value chains and competitive advantage can be quite different from what an outsider would really assume. So, for example, Walmart is in the logistics business and not really in the food selling business. What is something about a payments business that an outsider or one of your customers wouldn't really appreciate or assume that you're doing and it's part of your competitive advantage and your value chain?
So I think what I just mentioned is part of it, is that, you know, people sometimes say to me, you know, when we were pitching or whatever, that, you know, well, payments is a commodity, and you're like, yes, and we very much view what Stripe does that's really valuable is that we solve a whole host of other problems. You know, the payments piece was in a sense already solved. We solve a whole host of other problems that was preventing them from being able to run a business. I think the other thing that we've generally felt really strongly about that the rest of the world hasn't really come around to is that the quality of the technology, the quality of the APIs and abstractions you're giving people is really, really important, because, you know, fundamentally the way the architecture of a product flows is people kind of, you know, decide how to build it, and then they, you know, get a first version running, and then they start iterating on that, and, you know, at a certain point people say, oh, we should think about what we are going to use for payments, but it's too late, you know, it's already up and running. And I think other companies tend to look at, you know, good APIs and, you know, good technology like frosting that you can just like slather on the product, whereas in fact it's really core to how the product operates and what it is. And so that's the thing that I think we believe really strongly that no one else does.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're going to wrap up the questions now. Thank you so much, Paul and John, for your time and your insights tonight. I think everyone really appreciated your honesty and I think your breadth of knowledge that's kind of come through in terms of, you know, your experience and how you've got all these other examples of of other things that other people have done that you can draw from, which I think is really important. You know, giving real life examples to people here in the room. So thank you so much for your time. Now, start up.